Hey folks, this is a brief introduction video to the ancient Greek philosophers and ancient Greek philosophy, at least the part of it that we are going to study. Traditionally, in political theory or in political philosophy, we break up the history of Western political thought, and again, right, this is the history of Western political thought we're talking about, which is not the history of all political thought. But in Western political thought, we typically start with the ancient Greeks, start with Socrates, and move through the medieval political theorists like Augustine and Aquinas, then move up into the moderns, particularly the social contract theorists, and through the moderns and on to contemporary material, 20th, 21st century stuff. And so we sort of trace a line there, and we trace it all back to the ancient Greeks, and particularly to Plato, who we're going to be reading in this class. Um, and it's fashionable to say, or at least it used to be, to say that the history of Western political thought is just a footnote to Plato, right? As if everything is contained in his many dialogues, and particularly the Republic, which we're going to read in this first week, and that everything else is an articulation or response or an exchange with those ideas. And of course, this is often said by people who study Plato, ancient um, political theorists, or people who specialize in ancient political thought. But to understand sort of the arc of these first few theorists, and we're only going to read Plato. Socrates is a character in Plato's writings. It's important to understand the relationship between these actual individuals. And first comes Socrates, who is, in many people's eyes, sort of the founding moment, the founding figure of Western political philosophy. And he was the teacher, and teacher is sort of a vague term. He went around questioning ideas and teaching the people, teaching through his Socratic method of questioning. And one of the young folks who followed him was Plato. And so Plato considered Socrates his teacher. The Apology, which we read first, is one of what we call the early Platonic dialogues, in which Plato is trying to capture and represent to the world the thoughts of his teacher Socrates. And so sometimes we say that these are the Socratic works, or that these are Socratic philosophy, and that the later works, like the Republic, are the mature Plato. And this gets into issues of interpretation, which are very complicated, but just having the basic relationship. Socrates came first. Um, he taught some stuff. Plato picked up that torch. First, he sort of captured in the Apology the last days, the trial of Socrates, his teacher, his master, whatever you want to call it, um, and represented sort of that conflict that Socrates had with the Athenian people, and then moves on to try to advance the goals of philosophy that were started with his teacher. And now we get on to Aristotle, who was Plato's student, right? So we see this teacher and student dynamic occur again. And Aristotle picked up the torch from Plato and said, I think that he got all this right, but here are some major revisions. And we kind of stake out these three figures, but particularly the contrast between Plato and Aristotle as sort of central to the canon, the great works, the great ideas, and great traditions of Western political thought. And what I have here, the picture, the painting, is School of Athens by Raphael. Which hangs in the Vatican. And notably, I will say my mother, when we visited the Vatican, when I don't know, I think I was a senior in high school when we went to Italy. And, it's one of the most famous paintings in all of the world. And so, of course, there are big signs everywhere that say no flash photography. And so, of course, my mother took a picture of us in front of it. The flash goes, which over hundreds of years will ruin a great painting like this. And so, that's my experience with School of Athens. But I like to start with it because it depicts all of these great ancient philosophers, and the center piece is Plato and Aristotle. And you can see them, right? I have them labeled. It's a bit more contentious whether or not this is Socrates over here. Um, but I think it's certainly in keeping with Socrates arguing with these general men, or having a exchange, a dialogue, a conversation with them, and none of them, particularly this gentleman. But I want to. This person's like, I want to get out of here. This person's like you're ruining my life, and this person's like contemptuous. I can't believe what I'm hearing. That's essentially the legacy of Socrates, is that he went and he disturbed people. He had these talks and made people uncertain about their beliefs, and made people question, or showed them the hypocrisy of their beliefs and things like that. And so that's Socrates represented there. But then importantly, we have Plato, and Plato. I mean, of course, these are the central figures here, Plato and Aristotle, and so it's a representation of their importance in the canon. But specifically, this is Plato because he's pointing up, and that this is Aristotle because he is putting a hand out, saying like, no, 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 like down the earth, right? So up the clouds, down the earth, up away from the earth, down grounded, right? Think of grounded. And that's important for their philosophies and understanding the differences between the two. So very briefly, and I got to move my face out of the way. So the three of them, Socrates, and we will discuss each of them more specifically, less with Aristotle because we're not reading Aristotle. Socrates is known for the Socratic method of questioning, right? Asking questions. Well, does it mean you believe this? Well, could you please explain it to me? Where the character of Socrates asks questions of people who think they have a certain, very important piece of knowledge, and he shows the knowledge that people have to be false and leads them in the conversation to a different conclusion, and usually in a way that irritates them quite a lot. But that Socratic style of teaching through questions is something that's important about Socrates. We know him as the gadfly. We will talk about this more as well. But the one who disrupts, right, is what that means. It's a metaphor for the fly that bites the horse and disrupts it from its slumber, and that he was the gadfly for Athens. And do we have gadflies today? John Stuart Mill will talk about Socrates as the gadfly and how valuable he was to society. Socrates is famous for saying he was the wisest because he knows nothing, right? And the idea here is that all of the supposed knowledge that Socrates encountered turned out to be nonsense, and nonsense was worse in Socrates' eyes than simply saying, "I don't know the answers," right? I don't know what the truth is, but I know it's not that. Was a wise thing to say. So all of the priests and the poets and the philosophers that the so-called philosophers of the day who believed in what Socrates called received wisdom, or what we would refer to as received wisdom. Socrates unmasked them as not understanding their own views and not knowing where they come from and not holding consistent views. And in doing so, he showed that he was smarter than everyone. Right? That's one of the things that Socrates is most known for. Picking up on that idea, the idea that we should reject received wisdom, or at the least we should not simply accept it because it was the way other people before us understood things, and particularly how is received wisdom transferred down through culture, through political leaders and politics, through religion and religious figures, and through authority in general. It's true because someone else said so. And so I have my other video here of the Euthyphro dilemma from the dialogue Euthyphro, where Socrates has that conversation about religion. Well, things are just true because the gods say so, and he kind of unmasks that as as simply a source of authority and not a reasoned argument for something, right? So the reason we call Socrates the sort of start of Western philosophy is this idea that if you believe something, you should be able to give reasons and arguments to justify it to other people, not simply, well, because the God said so, because this book says so, because dear leader says so. No, what are the reasons, right? So philosophy is this idea that we give reasons to each other. And of course, he is killed for this by the people of Athens, by the democracy of Athens. There are specific charges that we can discuss, but essentially they're saying, hey, you know what? This culture, this religion, our political authority, all of our rules and norms and customs, that's that's what makes life hold together. That's what makes things work. You're going to walk around and show that it's all nonsense. We're going to have chaos. We're going to have anarchy. What do you propose to replace this with? And Socrates said, I don't know, right? I don't know anything, but I know that what you're saying, what you're selling is a bunch of BS. And I would rather, I should have it up here, but the unexamined life is not worth living. I don't want to live a peaceful, well-regulated life under a bunch of lies. I'd rather have truth, right? Is this idea? I'd rather die for the truth. And Athens says, we're going to kill him. And they do, right? He famously drinks hemlock poison and dies. Now, Plato observes all this and records it. And I think that a very interesting way to think about Plato is he takes up this gauntlet, right? That's thrown down um, when his teacher is killed, with this idea of, well, what are you going to replace this? Where's the truth? If the truth is not custom, religion, authority, all of the worldly knowledge that is passed down from people from one generation to the next, how do we find truth? And Plato says, I'll show you, I'll find you some truth. And, in a sense, the Republic is his great effort, his masterwork. Um, the most famous, I've got a bunch of versions of it, because it is his most famous and most important work of his many dialogues. And yeah, he says, I'm going to show you how we find truth. And not only that, I'm going to show you how we build a republic, a state that that finds the truth and is governed by truth and achieves the perfect good society and the good life for its citizens. And I'm gonna show you how we do that, right? So one thing that's important in the way that Plato does this, and you see this in the cave, which we're going to read, right? The allegory of the cave in book 7, the most famous part of the most famous work by the most famous philosopher, um, in which Plato shows us that the way where you find truth and the good life is from reason and rationality. Right? You need to get abstract, universal reason, and you need to clear away all of the worldly bias and the interests that come from living in this world, the experiences that real people have that blind us to the higher abstract truth. Right? This idea that there is and that's why he points up. We need to get away from the world and the way things work that we see with our senses. We need to get away from our senses, close our eyes, think with our minds. And one way we always, as we'll discuss, he says, start with mathematics. Think about 2 plus 2 equals 4. Picture it in your mind. Picture a square. Picture things that are perfect and pure ideas. There's no such thing as a straight line or a square in the real world. Everything is imperfect that you see with your senses. But imagine it in your mind, the beauty of math, how it all fits together perfectly, right? And that's the way that Plato conceives of not simply the math and physics and things like that, but the whole world, truth, justice, all of our ideas have a perfect form. He calls them forms that are true and pure and universal, and everything in this world is just that we see with our senses some distortion, some reflection of those true ideas. And so we got to abstract back. How can we do that? How can we escape all of the bias of our world and find truth? All the things that Socrates went around and said, look, that's false. Look, that's false. Look, that's false. Well, how do we we live in the world? How do we get away from it? How do we find out where the truth is? And his answer is we need to raise up some philosopher kings who are so rational and so purely formed in their education and their training that they can see the truth, and then they can just tell us, right? not very democratic. The people don't decide. The people are fools. They killed Socrates. The people are fooled by all the shadows, all of the reflections of things. Only the philosopher kings, those handful of philosophers trained up to be able to imagine, rationalize the universal pure truths of knowledge that are true for everyone, everywhere, and all times. And then they can build and run a state that functions based on these true rules, whereas the people cannot. Right. So not right. It's kind of interesting from the start that that this core philosopher, everything's a footnote to Plato, and Plato is best known for his advocacy of philosopher kings. Right. Not very democratic. Right off from the bat, we want to ask ourselves: can we take from anti-democratic thought and find meaning for a society where we are fully committed to democracy? Right? It's not a question if we're going to get rid of democracy. Well, hopefully, right? We got an election coming up, but it's not. It's not something that we as thinkers in a political theory class or as citizens are willing to endorse. And so finally, then, right after Plato, we have Aristotle, who takes up this gauntlet as well of let's find some real truths, plural, out there in the world, but doesn't believe, as his teacher Plato did, that we can escape from the world and find meaning outside of it. Aristotle says the world is all there is. The world is the only. If you take seriously Plato's idea that the world is all full of distortions and reflections. But how could we know anything except by observing with our senses, watching, learning, talking? And Aristotle says that's all we've got, right? There is no access to these objective universal forms. All we have is the real stuff, the physical things, real governments, real peoples, real institutions that we can observe and figure out which ones work a little better, which ones work a little worse, refine, refine, refine. Um, Basically, Aristotle is the first great scientist, the first great political scientist, right? It's one of the reasons that in political science we teach him a lot. He says, let's observe and look at all the data, and we'll come up with hypothesis and look at the data again and refine our hypothesis, and we'll figure out what works best and what works a little bit worse and a little bit worse. And we'll try to come up with systems and categories and classifications to understand all these things. There's no one best that we can access, but we can figure out better and worse. We can come up with some rules, some trends, how things usually happen, the kind of stuff we do in political science. So Aristotle, instead of saying let's get away from everything we observe and just think, he says let's really look at the world and look at it systematically and try to figure out and make sense of it as best we can. And he's, we'll talk more about Aristotle later, but he's known for a few things. His theory of justice is best summed up as treat likes alike and treat unalikes unalike. Right? That it's a very hierarchical way of thinking that the good should be given all the good stuff, all the rewards, all the praise, all the power. The vicious bad people, the unvirtuous people, the people who don't have good characters, we should be mean to them. We should be dismissive of them. They are bad, and we should treat them as bad people. Right? This basic idea of justice, treat good people good and bad people bad, is sort of traced back to Aristotle's thinking. A few other this is embodied in the idea of virtue ethics also, this idea that there are certain virtues, what it means to be a good person. Aristotle believed that there was something called teleology, that everything has a purpose in this world, and to be a good person is to embody certain character traits. And importantly, one of the reasons why we teach Aristotle is because he called us political animals. That's his analysis of our human nature, that our virtues, that we become the best humans when we engage in self-government, when we engage in politics and discussion and reason and dialogue and philosophy together. That's where we develop our language and our thinking and our friendships and our relationship. And that's all the best stuff, all the higher ends, the rationality that Plato loved. That's how you develop it for Aristotle. And he's also famous for talking about golden means, the idea that the most famous example is probably that courage is not being afraid of anything; it's being appropriately afraid, not being scared of things you shouldn't be, but not being scared of things that are scary, right? That the soldier who runs into battle heedless of the overwhelming force bearing down on him is rash, not courageous. Right? This idea that every virtue, every best character trait is a mean, is an appropriate balance, is something that we also trace to Aristotle. So yeah, 20 minutes. That's about as long as I want to go, and we'll talk a little bit more about each of these folks in class and in future lectures. But hopefully, this gives you a good overview of the ancients, as we call them, the ancient political thinkers.